We're here to dig past the surface level, to get into the source material on topics you think you know.
And today's topic is a big one.
It really is. We're embarking on a mission into a text that a lot of people see as definitive proof for something huge. We're talking about Acts chapter 20.
Specifically verses 6 through 16.
Exactly. And this short passage is, it's often held up as the primary evidence that the early apostles shifted the day of worship.
From the seventh-day Sabbath to Sunday, the first day of the week.
Right. But the sources you brought to us, they argue that this understanding is, well, fundamentally flawed.
It's flawed because it makes two critical mistakes. It uses the wrong calendar, and it misinterprets the original Greek language.
So our mission is clear. We want to see how the Jewish feast calendar, and specifically the countdown to Pentecost, completely changes the meaning of that meeting in Acts 20.
It changes everything.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the calendar, because without it, the whole narrative is just untethered.
That is the crucial context check. You can't understand the timing of this meeting without recognizing that the entire timeline Luke provides in Acts 20 is not governed by Roman civil time.
Not the Monday to Sunday week we use.
Not at all. It is anchored entirely to the Jewish sacred calendar, the cycle of major feasts.
And the sources are really clear about where we are in that cycle.
Absolutely. Acts 20, verse 6, it tells us the journey takes place after the days of unleavened bread.
Okay.
That one phrase immediately links the entire account to the spring cycle of feasts.
Wait, I want to pause on that. Why is that one detail, that it's after unleavened bread, so critical for a meeting that happens weeks later?
Because of Paul's end goal, his destination.
Which the text also tells us.
Yes. Later, in verse 16, it says Paul was rushing to get to Jerusalem for the Feast of Pentecost.
Okay, so he has a deadline.
A sacred deadline. Pentecost is the 50th day. It's determined by counting from a specific point during the spring feasts. So if Paul is rushing toward that 50th day, then every single day and week in between has to be understood as part of that countdown.
So his whole journey, his urgency, it's all dictated by Pentecost. The argument then is that Luke's timeline has to be read through that lens.
It's the only way that makes sense. We have to use the language of that count, the feast chronology, to understand what's happening. If we don't, we're basically imposing a modern calendar onto a first-century Jewish-centric story.
And that completely shifts the framework. It turns a simple travel log into a high-resolution map of sacred time, which brings us to the language, the linguistic detail that really creates that aha moment.
It does. Most modern Bibles, in English, translate Acts 20.7 as on the first day of the week.
Which naturally makes us all think of Sunday.
Of course.
Yeah.
But the sources argue that translation really obscures the context. The actual Greek in the foundational manuscripts is mieton sabbaton.
Mieton sabbaton. And we need to slow down here, right? Because translating that as first day of the week is, well, it's an interpretation.
It's an interpretation driven by a later assumption that Sunday had already become the day of worship.
But if we just look at the Greek words themselves, what are they literally saying?
The literal translation is one of the Sabbaths. Or you could even argue first of the Sabbaths.
One of the Sabbaths.
Yes. And this exact phrasing, it's not unique. It's Sabbath counting language. You find it elsewhere in texts that are dealing with calendar management, specifically counting weeks defined by the Sabbath. It's not Roman weekday language.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Why would Luke use calendar counting language related to Sabbath? Unless he was talking about the specific mandated count toward Pentecost, which we already know Paul was rushing towards.
That's the core of the argument. It connects us right back to the commandment in Leviticus 23. You see, the countdown to Pentecost is highly specific.
Can you just walk us through that? Because Pentecost is just a name for most of us, not a chronological command.
Of course. So after the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which Acts 20.6 confirms Paul has just observed, the command in Leviticus 23 is to count. 7 Sabbaths shall be complete.
7 complete Sabbaths.
Yes. You are mandated to count 7 of them. The count begins on the first weekly Sabbath during unleavened bread, and it continues week by week, defining that entire period until you reach the 50th day.
Which is Pentecost.
Which is Pentecost, from the Greek Pentecost out the 50th. So that 50-day countdown is the only thing that matters chronologically between these two feasts.
Okay, I see. So the whole 7-week period is structured by these weekly Sabbaths that you have to count.
Precisely. So if Paul is traveling during this mandated counting period, a period defined entirely by counting Sabbaths, and Luke records the meeting taking place on the Mieton Sabbaton, perfectly aligns the meeting in Troas with Paul's urgent sacred timeline. It's a precise chronological marker.
That makes so much sense. It feels like we just put the correct lens on the historical telescope. So we've got the calendar context and the language. But does the actual narrative, what Paul did right after the meeting, support this reading?
It does. Let's look at the logistics. We have to remember the Jewish concept of a day is sunset to sunset.
Right.
So if the phrase means Sabbath of the count, then the gathering happened on the seventh-day Sabbath.
And the details fit. Paul preached until midnight.
Yep. And Acts 20, verse 8, specifically mentions that many lamps were lit. If you're gathering on the Sabbath, which begins at sundown, the lamps are lit after sundown so you can continue the gathering.
So, biblically speaking, even though it's late at night, it's still the same seventh-day Sabbath until the sun comes up.
Exactly. The meeting ends on the Sabbath night. And now we get to what our sources call the travel proof. It's maybe the strongest circumstantial evidence in the text. If this meeting was about starting a new holy day Sunday, you'd expect Paul to honor it, to rest.
But he does the exact opposite.
He does. The text says that as soon as the Sabbath ended at daybreak, Paul left. He walked from Troas to Assos. That's about 30 to 32 kilometers.
30 kilometers on foot, immediately after an all-night meeting. I mean, if the day he started walking Sunday morning was supposed to be the new holy day.
Why did he immediately engage in strenuous working day travel? That makes no sense.
It's a paradox.
It is. If he's teaching Sunday sacredness, he immediately violates it in the most public way. But if he honored the Sabbath with a farewell meeting, then his actions on the next day, Sunday, simply prove it was a normal workday for him.
So his practical itinerary grounds the entire argument. He honored the Sabbath with a meeting and then resumed his rush to Pentecost, treating Sunday as just another travel day.
It's very compelling. The argument is that this passage actually supports Sabbath keeping and shows Sunday being used as a normal day for work.
Okay, now we absolutely have to address the other pillar of the traditional interpretation, and that's the reference to breaking bread.
Right, the phrase "klasai arten." Some scholars will argue that this phrase in this context establishes Sunday worship because they link it to a formal liturgical ceremony.
The Eucharist or communion. And, on the surface that sounds reasonable given later Christian history, but what do the sources say about how Luke, the author, uses that phrase in the rest of the book of Acts?
And this is where specificity is so important. To say this phrase means a unique Sunday ceremony requires ignoring how Luke uses it everywhere else.
Okay, so give us an example.
In Acts chapter 2, it says the early believers were devoted to fellowship, prayer, and the breaking of bread. But then just a few verses later, in verse 46, it says they were breaking bread from house to house and sharing meals.
Daily.
Daily, that's the key. If they were breaking bread daily, as the text says, it can't simultaneously be an act that is unique to or is proof of a new Sunday holy day.
That's a crucial distinction. When you look at Luke's own usage, breaking bread in Troas sounds much more like a shared communal meal, a farewell feast with Paul.
It sounds less like the institution of a new holy day that changes the entire sacred calendar.
Yeah.
And that's the ultimate conclusion from the sources. There's no command for Sunday rest here, no Sabbath change, and no institution of Sunday holiness. It was just a farewell meal held on the seventh-day Sabbath.
Wow. This really demands that we apply some intellectual rigor to passages we thought we knew. Okay, let's recap the key takeaways for you so you can walk away with this distilled.
First, Acts 20 is framed entirely by Jewish feast timing. Paul's urgency to reach Pentecost sets the clock for the whole narrative.
Second, the language is paramount. The Greek, miatun sabbatun, isn't a Roman weekday. It's feast-counting language from Leviticus.
Third, the gathering itself happened on the seventh-day Sabbath, extending from sunset into the night, but still on the Sabbath.
And fourth, Paul's own actions. He walked over 30 kilometers at daybreak on the following day, which shows that Sunday was treated as a day for travel and work, not a new day of holy rest.
The conclusion, therefore, is that this passage doesn't teach Sunday sacredness at all. When you look at it through the lens of the original language and the calendar context, it actually supports the keeping of the Sabbath. And this raises a really important question for you to consider. When we rely only on modern translations without checking the original language and the historical context, like this whole Pentecost counting cycle, how many other foundational assumptions might we be missing?
What other common ideas about biblical chronology might change if we apply this same kind of rigor to other familiar texts?
Something to think about.